Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session on how to use data to drive teaching and learning. And according to where you're coming from, it's either morning, afternoon, or evening. Here from lovely Greece, it's sort of mid-morning, I guess. So we'll dive straight into this session, which I'm quite excited about presenting because it picks up on some topics I've been thinking a lot about over the years as an educator and teacher. I guess the first thing is we'll look at some of the learning outcomes for today's session, and I split those up into two areas. One is focusing on assessment, so we'll be acknowledging assessment, and I'll be giving you a bit of my worldview on how I see assessment and how I think it enhances student learning and supports the decisions that we can make as teachers. And then we'll be looking in a little bit more detail in data and what data actually means and how we can interpret some of that information we gather from our students and also how we're able to analyze and interpret some of that assessment data to look at some learning patterns and student needs, and then a bit of data-driven instruction. So recognize how assessment can inform our teaching practice and strategies, and obviously improve our student outcomes, which is what we're all aiming for as an end result. A little bit about myself. I've been an educator for a hell of a long time, over 30 years. I know I look young, but it's been a long journey. I'm currently in a position as Senior Advisor in Education for the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and as the name precludes, it is based in Melbourne, but it has also campuses around the world, and one of those campuses is in Barcelona, and I work for them remotely from Greece. I've been doing so for the last couple of years. I also have a master's in learning sciences and technology, so I usually term myself more as a learning scientist rather than as an educator, because I'm a big advocate of the science of learning, and a learning designer for a long time before it became very popular and very sexy post-COVID. I've been developing courses and training and taught in learning design in higher education, primarily been teaching in adult education, so vocational education, higher education, and English as a second language. Done some consultancy work, and I currently deliver the ICT program, GCSE, at Gotronis International School, which is an IPLS school at Pearson and has been for the last couple of years. We've been going on this journey with Pearson since 2022, post-COVID. It's been a really invigorating, I would say, an enjoyable journey for us as a school. And I've been teaching in there and providing some professional development for teachers who are teaching into that program. As you would have worked out, originally from Australia, but now live in Greece with my family. Okay, so this presentation has two parts. The first part will be looking at assessment as a tool for gathering data, and the second part for using that data to inform your teaching practice. Now, as I said to Stacey, I could talk about assessment till the cows come home, and not just for the next 15 minutes, which was what I've scheduled. So I'd love to get your feedback as I'm going through this session, because Stacey and I have been talking about a possible mini series on assessment for the new year. I feel, and Pearson and Stacey also feel, it's an important topic. And we've had some feedback from previous workshops and sessions we've done with people who are asking more about assessment. So let us know in the chat if you'd love to be involved or to participate in a session on assessment. So we'll be touching on that today a little bit. All right, let's jump straight in. Assessment, it's not a dirty word. Okay, I keep saying that for years. Assessment needs to be introduced right from the outset. It's front and center of our teaching and learning. And I think as educators and for our learners, we need to be able to convey that about assessment really early on. It's not something that we do as an afterthought or something that comes at the end, for that matter. And I'll talk more about that throughout the presentation. And just like good herbs and spices and sprinkling on our food to make it edible and enjoyable, assessment needs to be sprinkled throughout the whole learning. So there are many different types of assessment, and I try and keep it simple in relation to assessment, and I'll introduce you to some of the assessment that I use with my learners. But the idea is to be creative and to try and pick up on the personalities and within your own group of learners and what would work well in terms of assessment tasks. One approach that I've used successfully and others have used successfully over the years, and this is an approach that's predominantly been first and foremost in higher education, but certainly I've used it in secondary education and other teachers have, and even in primary, is the framework of constructive alignment. And some of you may be aware of constructive alignment, but constructive alignment is quite simple in its approach, yet it's a sort of that aha moment for a lot of educators who may not have come across it. And what it is, it's an integration of what I call those three moving parts of our learning process, which is our learning outcomes, our learning activities, and our assessment tasks. And that these three tasks are not isolated, that they work together and that they are integrated. So thinking about how will students learn, what students should know, and how will learning be measured. And I guess when we're talking about assessment, we're talking about how we'll be measuring that assessment. So this is a constructive alignment that came from Biggs and Tang, got a reference there to them. And it should be in different forms at different stages. Now, it doesn't matter where the design point starts for you as an educator. I personally like to start at the assessment because, as I said, I put assessment first and foremost within the learning process and within my own teaching practice. So I start there and then move to the learning outcomes and then to the learning activities. But then throughout the learning journey or the learning process, I will adjust my activities. I will adjust my assessment tasks, but usually my learning outcomes are fixed. So we're really going to concentrate. Again, I could talk about constructive alignment for quite a while. I'm quite passionate about it as a process. But for today, it's really about thinking about how assessment is, again, first and foremost in that process. And we need to be thinking about it really, really early on. Now, if you Google different types of assessment, you'll get something longer than a shopping list. And there's so many forms out there now. I like to use specific assessment that I've used for a number of years, and it works for me as an educator. I find it works for my learners. I adapt that accordingly, obviously. But some of those, and I'll present some of these today for you, and I'm sure that you use them as educators as well in your teaching practice. But first and foremost, diagnostic assessment for me is critical. As I said, I teach, so I'll be using examples around ICT. I teach ICT, information communication and technology, and I teach year 7, 8, and 9 at the Cotronis International School. But these students have been exposed, as we've been running the program now for 2, going on to the 3rd year in iPrimary. And they're coming with certain skills. And I need, as an educator, to have a clear understanding right from the outset about what those skills that they possess are. Our students, as I say, don't come to us as empty vessels to be filled. They already have some skills and knowledge that they've acquired, not just within the school environment, but outside, particularly in the ICT space. They're acquiring some of these skills outside of the school environment. So a diagnostic assessment is really critical for me at that early stages. The other thing I like is peer assessment and self-assessment. And I've got that there, has that equaling self-reflection. For me, if there's no reflection, there's no learning. And usually this is non-graded. I use this approach, and I'll talk a little bit about non-graded assessment in a moment. But peer assessment and self-assessment is a big one. And I usually love to have projects. I used to teach authentic learning and assessment as a graduate certificate at university level. And I always talked about assessment being authentic. And what I mean by that is that it needs to mirror real world scenarios, more so in the adult education sphere for obvious reasons. But even for our young learners, I give them projects as they will have later on in whatever sort of workplace they end up in. So projects are usually 4 to 6 weeks, as the research has shown. They need to be sort of to that level, and they usually pick up a number of elements in the unit. And an example of that is I had my year 9s recently undertaking a project where they create a business, they build a business, a logo, a flyer, a website, or promotional presentation, and then peer assess that with some criteria. And this mirrors paper 2 in the ICT final exam. So it's drawing on the assessment that the summative assessment, exam assessment they'll need to undertake, a project-based assessment within them, and a lot of peer reflection and self-assessment. Love formative assessment. Use it all the time. Usually non-graded, as I'm sure you also use formative assessment sprinkled throughout the process. There are some wonderful tools now in making our life easier as educators and making assessment fun. And it's also a good way to gather some of that data and information. So big fan of formative assessment throughout a particular learning journey for students. And then lastly, some summative assessment. There's always some summative assessment in there. As I said, I've been talking and thinking about assessment for a while, but there are educators worldwide who have lived and breathed assessment most of their adult life. And one of those is Phil Race, who I love to read some of his work on assessment. And he's a big advocate of that no summative assessment should be more than 25%. And I've sort of taken that on board and had good results around that. I'm sure some questions are flying in on the assessment, Stacey, no doubt, as it's always a good topic. One of the things that, as again, I'm a big advocate around is non-graded assessment. And why the case isn't here, it's also one that I'm a big advocate of, particularly in this country, in Greece. And why I say that is that it has a strong emphasis on grades. It might be the case in your particular country where you're joining from today, where grades are almost first and foremost. Here, it's almost an unhealthy sort of environment where students are sort of branded as an 18 student. Our grades are out of 20 in secondary, out of 10 in primary. So once students hit secondary education, they sort of identify as an 18 student or a 17 student or a 15 student, which I have huge problems with and constantly going on about what does that mean in a sense. So therefore, I do a lot of non-graded assessment, which has been a real eye-opener for a lot of the other teachers, but also for a lot of the learners in class. But what it does is, as I pointed out here, it has so many benefits. It creates a growth mindset, it establishes learning needs, it builds that teacher-student communication. So it's dialogue focused. Non-graded assessment is dialogue focused. What that means, it shifts the focus from grades to conversations about learning progress. It makes for immediate adjustments to our work as educators. We don't need to go away and grade things, which take time, and then we've moved on, and the cognitive sort of process of our learners has moved to the next stage of their learning, and it's very difficult to bring them back to that particular moment of the learning. So, it has that immediate adjustment. You can give something in class, a quiz or something of that nature, and provide feedback straight away. And it also promotes a lot of self-reflection, and it creates that safe, supportive space. We all know the pressures that come with grades or a grade attached or examinations or tests. For me, it's not conducive to our learners or our students being able to feel comfortable, feel supportive, and feel that their needs are being met, or that they have a space to be able to express themselves. So a big fan of non-graded assessment. We live in interesting times, there's no doubt. And, generative AI has come with a bang, and it's certainly not going anywhere quickly. This is another topic, Stacey, we could pick up on as well. It could be another session in itself. But just very quickly, as an educator, I won't talk so much as a student, as a learner, but as an educator, I am using generative AI on a daily basis to inform my practice, to help build some of those assessment tasks that good old ChatGPT tells me it can do in an inclusive, clear, focused way that will promote student growth. And yeah, with a little bit of tweaking from my end, it does that. But it allows me time to focus on the important things within the classroom. And I'm sure a lot of you are using some sort of generative AI in your teaching practice. For those that aren't, it might be worth exploring that a little bit. And also being conscious, again, just very briefly, that prompting these machines is key in what sort of information you'll get. So just to finish up that first part on assessment, is that be mindful to measure what you value instead of valuing only what you can measure. I think that's important. The second part is moving into using the data or the information to inform our teaching practice. And I'll give some examples here about my own practice, and I guess what also I've been able to talk to other educators about within the Cotronis International School, and what I've used and with my own practice have continued to sort of develop over the years. Again, from an ICT perspective, I guess, and some of this information for some of you will be things that you're already aware of and things you've already included in your practice. But I hope there's some takeaways here about how useful or how that information can be used to inform our teaching. So the first process is really all about a collect and store. And we now have technology, which gives us a wonderful affordance. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the days when, as a teacher, you'd be writing copious notes, or everything would be paper-based, and trying to keep track of that. The technology now allows us these wonderful affordances of being able to track and keep information and show information at an instance. And this is where data has really, we're talking about generative AI at the moment, but before generative AI, it was all about data, if people remember, and also within the educational setting. So I use a very simple approach. Personally, I use a centralized system. I use a spreadsheet to work on my student results. For some others, there might be a learning management system or some specialized software that you might use. There's a lot of tools out there, but for me, it's just the basic information and detail. This is just something I've developed for my ICT students. I usually have tabs for each of the assessment tasks, like you can see below: project, diagnostic, or quiz, and try and keep areas in there that are around intervention, my notes, areas for improvement, strength, really sort of anecdotal data. This particular one here, example, doesn't have a score. It was a formative assessment task that wasn't graded, but that doesn't mean I can't get information from it that I can use later. So that's just one example. And I really do, for those who don't use spreadsheets, I do encourage you. I used to loathe them for years, loathe them. But I've come to warm to them as time has gone on, and I really do encourage you to try and develop some of your skills for those who haven't, and to look at functions like product function that allows you to keep some of this information. The other thing I'm big on is wrangling the data, as I call it. And I wrote a paper a few years ago when I was in higher education about data wranglers and how important they are within an educational setting, and how every educationalist should have a data wrangler with them. Of course, we don't have this sort of luxury where we do a little bit of everything nowadays as educators, but in the higher education setting, which are bigger institutions with a lot more staff and a lot more support, data wranglers are big now in looking at student data. So we need to be data wranglers ourselves. We need to be thinking how we organize the data, how we visualize the data. Some of the things that I look for is obviously, class individual performance, but also group performance. And one analogy that I use, that I've been using with my students, and this is from my days in vocational education, is I try and think about how am I getting data on their knowledge, skills, and attitude. So these are three areas that I really sort of focus on. How do I gather some of that data? How do I gather that information through my different forms of assessment where I can see what are their skills, what's their knowledge, and what's their attitude, and how I can work on that. Now, data visualization in there's amazing things one can do now, but to be quite honest, I don't delve into this space a lot. I don't use heat maps or charts or graphs to a great extent. I want to use my time more constructively, I guess, about lesson planning and thinking about how I can use the data to inform my practice better rather than the visualization. But when you're speaking with fellow colleagues or the leadership group within the organization about certain changes that need to be made, data visualization can certainly assist in telling your story. So what should we be looking for in the data? Well, there's certain markers, as we all know. There's those individual markers and the group trends. And individual markers are about looking at performance. How can we identify students who, for example, are scoring below our benchmark, which we something we highlight within a school or within national standards or our curriculum. What are the benchmarks there? So identifying those, and then any improvement patterns as well. I mean, it's not just the punitive element of the data that we're gathering, and assessment seems to have that approach, which I'm always going on about, that it shouldn't just be punitive, it should inform and it should show us improvement, and we should celebrate those. So capture the improvement patterns, look for the upward trends in scores over time, talk about those, what your students are doing well in, not just what they're not doing well in. And then group trends, class averages, assess whether a class meets overall learning goals, what are they doing, and what skill gaps might exist. And of course, curriculum alignment in there. And some skill gaps might be, if 60% of students in a class score low, say on an essay, here I'm going more into that English language sort of area, and they're scoring low on essay structure, but they're excelling in grammar. You need to capture that. You need to identify that. You need to wrangle that information. So then you can focus your lesson plans more on essay writing. So it's that sort of approach that we need to be looking for. Some questions I ask in terms of interpreting the data, I'm always trying to look at the data, not just inputting it. I'm trying to read it. I'm trying to understand it. What am I looking for exactly? What's going to assist me as an educator in being able to change my instruction, in being able to change my approach for the next lesson, for the next term, for the next semester, what it might be. And what do you plan to do with the results? It's great getting this information, it's great getting this data, but if it's just sitting somewhere on a desktop or on a hard drive in a spreadsheet and you're not using it, then it's useless. And I think what we need to be mindful is that it's just like it should be front and center about informing your practice. So some of the things that I do is that I find a scheduled conversation with my learners can be effective. It can be really interesting to sit down and talk about where they're doing well, where they're not doing well, where we can improve. And if you're sprinkling in formative assessment and you're sprinkling elements of non-graded assessment, it takes away that punitive sort of approach to the learning and makes it more constructive. It's a bit like performance reviews in the workplace. We all have performance reviews. So we can sit down with our learners individually or as a group and review their performance. How are they going? I talk about this with my learners a lot, provides them an opportunity to express themselves. It makes it safe. It provides that growth mindset. And again, it brings assessment to the forefront and part of the conversation throughout the learning process. And also meet with your colleagues to interpret some of the data that you've gathered if you're on the right track and so forth. So assessment really is today's means of modifying tomorrow's instruction. Otherwise, why are we assessing? Why are we gathering that data? If it's not going to inform our practice, then why are we doing it? We really need to think about it. And this is, and particularly now around the use of generative AI. For years as a learning designer, particularly in higher education institutions, I kept telling academics and teachers and others, you need to be creative around your assessment. You cannot give an essay topic. You cannot give a test. You cannot just give an exam. Our argument was always, this is not an authentic task. This is not something that young people or young adults will be asked to do in a workplace environment. Therefore, what is your justification in providing this? We'd always hit a brick wall around this. We'd struggle with teachers and academics being more creative. But hoo-ha, generative AI came along and just put a smile on our face. So I now share very quickly some of that. I put some of that assessment task into generative AI, and there it is. And I tell academics, well, we need to be more creative. I tell teachers, well, we need to think outside what generative AI can do for us as educators. And there are some wonderful things around assessment, and I'm sure you're using in the classroom, and that is provided by IPLS as well in some of their session planning and workbooks that mirror what is expected of students. But it really is about modifying our instruction. To finish, I'm going to use a bit of a case study about how I sort of tackle a unit and say a 3-week or 4-week process with my students. So the case study is about how I incorporate the assessment data that I might gather into planning, and how I would change some of those activities that I do with my students. So every year I teach year 7 to 9. I've currently, in September, I started a new year 7 cohort that had already done 2 years of iPrimary in computer skills, or in the area of ICT. So the unit focused on digital presentation multimedia skills in a year 7 class. Now, the assessment, the summative assessment at the end of the previous unit involved students creating a digital presentation. And I'd done some diagnostic assessment with them, but it was obviously not enough to give me an idea of where they were at. So their previous assessment task, summative task, demonstrated certain information, or gave me certain information about their strengths and weaknesses. And the data I collected is that I saw that 70% of the students demonstrated strong design skills using templates, color schemes, and so forth, whereas some of the weaknesses were 50 to 60% struggled with organizing content, excuse me, organizing content and integrating multimedia. So therefore, that got me thinking about how I can change some of my, having this data, changing some of my approach to the learning. And the first thing that I did was that I established some mini lessons on multimedia. So short, sort of focused lessons, on embedding videos that you can find on YouTube, that you can find online, other external links, and practicing external links to presentations. And students practice these skills through guided examples that I provided or they were able to find. And then obviously some logical structuring of workshops. So in some interactive activities where students reorganize pre-made, poorly structured slides that I might have given them, or as I like to do is providing them with butcher's paper and texters and saying, okay, let's sit down and work out an approach on what would constitute well-structured slides in a particular order to create flow and clarity. Then you're going to get some differentiation, as I did. So I saw that there were some strong students in there that were able to advance, then they were able to excel in multimedia skills, and creating, being able to do some of that's what was required from them. So in this case, you give them that higher level task, or you give them more skills in, creating more complex presentation. Struggling students needed that extra help. But what I found was, joining small group tutorials to visit some of the basics around multimedia, embedding that is important. And then this is where peer collaboration comes in. So pairing stronger students with struggling. Now, I want to make a note here that throughout the learning process, well, my experience has always been that even struggling students at some point will be stronger students in other areas, and you can flip them around. You're not always asking the same strong students to be mentoring the same weaker students. I think it's sort of being able to identify within your student cohort where some students have strengths, where others have weaknesses, as we would do in a workplace environment. So I think it's important to do that so that it's not the same students being put in particular categories. And then this is where we bring in some new assessment. So a formative assessment task about looking at a short task, embedding some of this multimedia, which doesn't need to be graded, because what we want is we want to be able to give that immediate feedback for students. So getting them to do a particular task in class and providing that real-time feedback before they might do a summative project to seeing how they've progressed. So gathering some of that information. And then how do you measure the success? Well, final summative project is always on a real world issue. As we know, we want to tackle real world issues. We want to make it relevant and fun, and for students to become passionate about. One in ICT is obviously social media. So we use this one a lot, the impact of social media. They then create what they need in terms of their presentation. And then from then I'm able to gather more information. And some of the information I'm able to gather is that proficiency increased, and I saw that in my spreadsheet in the results that I got from 60 to 80, and I could see that there's logical structuring now, so there's a proficiency increase from 50 to 7%. And I've gathered that, and I've looked at that data, and I've noted that data, and then I've gone back to last year's data, and I've had a look, and I've seen that they were the similar results initially. So that now informs me that for next year's cohort in Year 7 2025 that will start in September, I need to be more mindful about how I present this topic. I need to be mindful that after 2 years running, that both these Year 7 cohorts exhibited some weaknesses in X and Y in multimedia integration and logical structuring. So I need to be upfront around this and maybe be a little bit more precise in the diagnostic sort of tool that I might use in asking sort of those questions. So that's where the affordance of having that information helps my instruction moving forward and into the future. And this segues into measuring against previous years. We are able to do that now in relation to gathering that information. We have that information. We have that as a resource that we're able to do. And, for my ICT class, I'm able now, as I say, to compare some of those scores or compare some of that anecdotal feedback that I provided myself, and to look at that from previous years. So I can look at things as benchmarking and comparative analysis. So how effective is my teaching? And I know I might need to change that a little bit. My learning outcomes won't change as much. My assessment tasks may well change, as I pointed out earlier, about putting some of that more formative assessment maybe earlier on, doing more. Goals and adjustments, so creating realistic goals based on the data and adjusting that. Adjustment is a big thing in our line of work as educators, so adjusting how I'm going to teach based on the trends that I've seen over the last year, over the last 6 months, over the last couple of years, or 4 years or 5 years, whatever it might be. And again, what I talked about, that longitudinal approach to tracking, monitoring individual and group growth. I think both are important in looking at both the individual, but also looking at your class as a whole and where they're moving with that. And one area that we haven't touched on, which is again another session in itself, as I used to teach rubric design, again for graduate certificates, is rubrics. And in this case, rubrics need to have a consistency, because if we keep changing the goalposts, as we say back home in Australia, this will cause an inconsistency in our evaluation and our gathering of results. So there certainly needs to be some consistency with our rubrics. It's not so much using the same year in, year out. There would no doubt be tweaks and changes. And I do a lot of rubric design with my students, actually, which I find as an interesting exercise. After all, it's looking at how we are assessing them. So I do a lot of that with them, but being consistent in your approach in your rubrics, so you have that consistency over 2 or 3 years. May mean you might change it later, but at least if you want to benchmark and have a comparative analysis of, say, a 3-year teaching period, it would be wise to keep your rubrics quite consistent. That brings us to the end, I guess, of this very short, sharp session on assessment and how we can use the data for gathering information. I always like to close with my learning outcomes at the end of a session of this nature, but also with my classroom sessions too, just to backtrack on what the learning outcomes were. I hope you've developed, and I'm sure you've had this appreciation of the role of assessment, but maybe have picked up a couple of things about how it could be further enhanced to support your student learning and your instructional decisions. I had a bit of an understanding or comprehension of the process of analysing and interpreting assessment. Without us doing that, then they're just numbers and notes. And if we're not using them to inform our teaching practice and our learning patterns and address our student needs, then what are we using that data for? Why are we gathering it? And recognizing how assessment data can inform, and it really can inform over a short period, from a day to day, even within a session itself, to over multiple years. So thank you very much. It is now time, Stacey, to come over to you, and we're just almost on 40 minutes. That's okay. We've got 20 minutes for questions.
Yeah, we've definitely got a few questions to ask you, which is great. But again, I'm echoing what Spiro said at the beginning of the session. If you'd like to hear more about assessment, please do let me know in the chat box, because we are going to be looking at creating a little bit of a mini series where we look at different aspects of assessment, and Spiros will be delivering those because he is kind of my expert in this case. So please do let me know in the chat. So questions, we have a few. So the first one came in quite early on in the session. How would you document a non-graded assessment for reference later?
Yeah, I use, apart from the observation is a big one. So I'm able to observe what the student's been doing. I take notes, a lot of notes in class, and you'll see that a lot of it has to, for the non-graded, you have to be taking notes. It could be at my computer, it could be on a notepad around how students are doing, and then I prefer to do it straight onto my computer as anecdotal feedback or anecdotal notes around how that student has been progressing. Sometimes I'm a big fan. I'll talk more about how we can provide feedback to students, but how we can provide feedback to ourselves. Another thing I do is I do a lot of voice recordings too, in capturing that and then transfer that across. I find that to be useful as well. So it does take time. There's no doubt about it. It's so much easier to have a test. So you get a grade, you pop in the grade, and it's done. But trying to capture it in those different forms at that moment, I think, is how I've always approached it.
Cool. Thank you. Sticking to non-graded assessments, what instruments do you use exactly, and are you providing the students with rubrics?
Yes, and yes, I provide students with the rubrics, and I give them the rubrics straight away. Like I said, a lot of times I design some of the rubrics with students, and if I'm not designing them with students, I'm giving them the rubric from the outset. Students need to know how they're going to be assessed. Students need to know what criteria I'm using. It shouldn't be something surprising for them. They should be aware of this. I'm very upfront and transparent. So yes, I provide the rubrics with student if I'm not developing some of the rubrics with student. And some of the tools, the first part of the question was what tools, Stacey? Was that?
Yes, what tools do you use?
What tools I use for the rubric design, or just tools using for?
Non-graded assessments. So I suppose the question's around how do you create them, and then how do you do you then give the students the rubrics to that?
Yeah, so I've got short rubrics can be quite complicated. Okay, they can be quite simple. So for more of, formative, and I don't always have a rubric for every formative or non-graded assessment. Even if it's non-graded, you can still obviously have a rubric to, really sort of direct your practice as an educator. But tools, I use simple tools. I don't use anything. I can't think of anything offhand in relation to a specific platform or software or tools that I use, but I just develop those tools through basic elements of whether it's Word or a spreadsheet or something of that nature. I guess it's more about the activities that I might do. The activities range, as I said, I'm a big on project activities, I'm big on hands-on. ICT can be very technical, so I try and get students to be doing a lot of hands-on, to be building things, to be actually drawing, to be actually writing, to expressing themselves. Some of the times I'm getting students up for presentation, so tools could be about presenting, getting them to present, using a rubric to, think about some of the things that I expect them to be showing me when they're presenting. Yeah, I can't think of something straight off the top of my head in relation to tools, but just everyday use of, the suite that you have available.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, we have an AI question. So one teacher asks, in my journey with generative AI, I've run into several instances where the result of my prompt progresses faster than the steps, through the steps of an activity or task than I would like. In these cases, they've had to spend extra time reprompting or adapting those tasks. Do you have a cheat sheet, or is there any kind of any recommendations that you would use to write better prompts when using AI?
Look, it's a good question, and I must say I use the paid version of ChatGPT. I must confess to that. And with the paid version of ChatGPT, you can, it's the best $20 a month I've spent, I must admit. But you're able to, with that, build your own ChatGPT, and I found that useful because I was finding similar problems with the free version in, constantly prompting and not getting the information I wanted. I guess, again, I can't go enough on about prompting and how critical it is. I know that you're constantly prompting and uploading new information into the ChatGPT, and that does take a lot of time and effort, and you're not getting the results that you would like to get at the end of the day. Maybe what I would say is scale it down. Don't be too ambitious to begin with. That's what I found. I sort of wanted something instantly. And then I thought, no, it's not giving me that. I sort of take it in stages and say, okay, if I've got a staged approach where I want a learning activity, don't give me the whole lesson plan. Let's develop the interactive activity for this particular cohort, for this particular subject. Give me some examples that you would provide for this, and take that and then build from that. So it's almost like a little bit of Lego, taking chunks of it rather than saying, here, give me a lesson plan for all of this, and confusing the machine. So that would be one aspect of it. It's still going to be frustrating as the machine learns and grows and becomes more adept. I try and keep the same chat open, as I'm sure you probably do as well, and uploading into that same chat that I've established around this. So even in the free version, you can do this, like I said, in the paid version, you can create your own ChatGPT and upload your own data within there and ask ChatGPT to use only that data that you've provided rather than what's out in the World Wide Web. And just, and taking that approach of just being mindful of how much information you're giving it.
Yeah, I think AI is a huge thing that everyone is dealing with, and it's just trying to find a way to navigate it. I've fallen into the trap of giving it so much stuff to do and then just kind of, this is too much, or it's not what I wanted. So yeah, baby steps is how I've kind of approached it, asking it to do small things and then building up from it. So thank you very much for that. I mean, AI might be something that we look at to do in the future as a session. It'd be good to see what people's appetite for that would be. So we've got 2 more questions. So if you have any more questions, please do pop them in the Q&A. Anything that we don't get to, as I did in the last session, I'll take it away and kind of email with answers. So the top question we've got, how can I ensure that data-driven instruction doesn't become too test-focused?
Yes, It's a good question. Yeah, it's a difficult one because I guess this is where you need that time to reflect as an educator. So saying, okay, and going back to constructive alignment at the beginning, which is, I think, a really important process to be able to do and say, okay, what are my assessment tasks going to be for this unit? How am I going to structure those? If I've got a 12-week plan, where am I going to have my diagnostic? Where am I going to have some peer reflection? Where am I going to have formative and so forth? And my summative at the end, which, yours might be more than 25%. That's, but, I do like the 25% because it gets you away from that higher grading and that test result. I think once you look at your sort of, your unit over a period of time, and you're reflecting and you're putting assessment first and foremost in your planning, then I've found that it takes away from that, more of that test-driven element to it. I would also be talking to peers, talk to some of your colleagues around this and say, look, this is something, have a look at my plan. This is where I've sprinkled my assessment throughout these 12 weeks of the semester. Is it too top heavy? Have I got too much testing in there? The other thing, of course, is that testing and you're using testing here as meaning perhaps not as that summative approach to testing, but, testing as in, measuring. See how your students are feeling about this, how your learners are feeling it. Are they saturated with too much testing? Because we can over-test at times, we can over-measure. So giving them, gauging from them, are we doing too much testing in this space? Do you feel it's time to move on? As reading our learners and asking for feedback around that from our learners, even at a very young, even in primary, can be a process then that we can then incorporate what their feedback is into our own practice. So I think some of those approaches could prove useful, but it is a difficult one. I found it to overwhelm sometimes my own teaching, is that maybe I'm testing too much here. Or the other flip side is not testing enough.
Oh, thank you very much. Again, we could probably talk for hours on that too. So the next question, how would you recommend dealing with data when cohorts are very small? For instance, this teacher teaches A-levels and they have very small classes, so they have a hard time identifying trends.
Yeah, and that's the same for me. I don't have large classes. Our classes average around size to 7, to around 7 in the classroom. I'm only seeing sort of large numbers now, or they started with large numbers and went down dramatically in some instances because of our program is the international program that's embedded, I guess, or into the national curriculum. Sometimes it makes it easier. You're not going to see the trends, obviously, but you can still pull data from trends. This is where, smart sort of functionality in spreadsheets can really prove useful. But it's like any sort of data where we go out for surveying and we make it a small cohort of results, and you say, okay, well, is this really meaningful? Yes, it is. It can be meaningful, and even with 2 or 3 or 4 or smaller numbers of students, it's meaningful because effectively it's learners coming back to you with their measurements or their feedback or their results. So I think firstly is, regardless of the number, I think you need to take the results on board and say, well, this is the cohort I have. Longitudinal sort of work around this in looking at it at 2-3 years time, particularly if those numbers fluctuate. Well, there you need to be mindful of that, and you're just conscious. You say, okay, I may have in 2022 I had 5 students. In 2023 I've had 10, and now I'm up to 15. I can't really gauge from what I did 2 years ago with such a small cohort to now, but bringing that into your conscious thinking as an educator and helping you then provide instruction for the next cohort, I think is important. But I still think, regardless of the numbers, that you're still able to gauge information, and information that can prove useful, even if it's from 1 student or it's a large cohort of 20 students. But it is challenging. I mean, I don't have a clear-cut answer for that one, because I deal with something very similar where I am, in that there's small cohorts and you really can't see much of a trend, but you can see some trend.
Cool. Thank you very much. So we've got 2 questions around kind of differentiation and extra support during assessment rather than kind of the teaching of it. So obviously when you're doing kind of the formative assessments in class, non-graded assessments, what kind of advice could you give for those students that might need that extra support during that assessment that you're providing them with? Any practical tips or advice?
It's always keeping the communications line open as an educator with learners, and again, this comes down to a personalized approach to your own teaching practice. My research over the years has been learners as designers. I'm always, this is where I start from. The questions are the curriculum. I guess I'm more of a facilitator rather than an instructional teacher. So I try and firstly listen to my students, and by doing that, and as you all, everyone has their own particular approach. In doing that, then you create that safe space, and that safe space where you can have the conversations with those students who might be struggling early on. And not only you're initiating the conversation, you want to get to that sweet spot where they're coming to you and having it. And it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And when that happens, that, the learning's kicked in, because it's that self-initialization from our learners that we want. So it's creating that space early on, but you can create that space by being upfront about your assessment, how you're going to measure the information you're going to gather. And then the differentiation is going to happen. You're going to have your weak students and your stronger students. But there are those weak students, and I'm really big on this, is I've always found in my years of teaching that, those weak students are also very strong in other skills. And let's not forget, we're not just talking about discipline related. I talked a lot about ICT, but I could do another session just on the soft skills and essential skills that are so critical. And you might have some students who are weak in your particular class, say in grammar, but they're fantastic collaborators. They're great on teamwork. So you bring them into a process where you might do a project that requires collaboration on an area, and they run that. They then become the stronger students. So I think, being mindful of that and flipping that, and that all students have a worldview, all students come with a skill set, and might not be related to your particular discipline area, but not forgetting those soft skills that a lot of students either have or don't have, and bringing those to the forefront as well. I hope I've gone a little bit around that question, I think, but there was something useful there.
Yeah, I suppose it's difficult, isn't it? Because every student is different in their own way, and there's not one size fits all approach. Yeah, it can be a tricky one to to answer, but also to implement in class. We don't have any more questions.
Okay.
So yeah, you've either stunned them, you've absolutely stunned them into silence and there is no more questions, or there are absolutely loads of questions that people are just waiting for the next instalment. So what we will look to do is do more on assessment in the new year, and we'll look at different aspects of it. And Spiros will work with me to write them and deliver them. But thank you very much, Spiros. Really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you, Stacey. Thank you, everyone, and do provide some feedback. This is so important for us, and particularly providing some feedback that might inform a session on assessment, because we need your feedback in order to get that information to develop a session that meets your needs and requirements. So please, any feedback that you can provide when the survey comes out would be greatly appreciated. Thank you all. Thanks for your time.